I'm Zinnia Calderón, 27. Until 3 months ago, I believed that some people simply vanish without consequence. Then a phone call from retired Detective Victor Malden changed everything. My stepfather, Julian Hart, the man who stole my inheritance and disappeared after my mother's death, was living 2 towns over under an alias, managing a historic estate as if he'd never destroyed anyone's life. My mother's last words to me still echo. Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who take everything. What she didn't know was that I'd been saving every dollar for 10 years, waiting for this moment. But here's what makes this story unbelievable. When I finally knocked on his door, I discovered he'd been expecting me all along. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Victor called, I was in my Boston workshop, carefully repairing the spine of a 1923 first edition Frost collection. My hands have always been steady with broken things, books, picture frames, the delicate mechanisms of antique clocks. There's something about restoring what others have given up on that centers me. Maybe because I understand what it feels like to be written off. Zinnia, I need you to sit down. Victor's voice carried that particular gravity I remembered from the weeks after Mom died. He'd been the only detective who seemed to care that Julian's story didn't add up. The only one who kept asking questions when everyone else wanted the case closed. Set down my bone folder and moved to the window overlooking Marlborough Street. October in Boston was all burnt orange and golden light. The kind of afternoon that usually made me grateful for the quiet life I'd built. What is it, Victor? I found him. Those 3 words hit me like cold water. For 10 years, Julian Hart had been a ghost, no social security activity, no credit cards, no trace. The man who'd married my mother when I was 14, who'd slowly isolated her from friends and family, who'd vanished with everything we owned 3 days after her funeral, had simply evaporated. Where? My voice came out steadier than I felt. Pemaquid. Point. He's calling himself Langley, now Robert Langley. Been managing the old Thornfield estate for the past 8 years. Lives in the caretaker's cottage, drives a modest sedan, keeps a low profile. I only found him because my nephew's girlfriend works for the county assessor's office. She recognized him from an old photo. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass. Pemaquid Point was less than 3 hours from our old hometown of Millfield, Maine. He'd been close this whole time. Close enough to see the life he'd left in ruins. Close enough to know that I'd had to drop out of high school and work 3 jobs just to survive. There's more, Victor continued. The estate's being sold. New owners take possession next month, which means he'll be moving on soon. Zinnia, if you're going to do this, I'm going to do this. The certainty in my voice surprised us both. For 10 years, I'd imagined what I'd say to Julian if I ever found him. Sometimes it was rage-screaming questions about why he'd targeted my mother. Why he'd taken everything. Why he'd left me with nothing but debt and a house that smelled like her perfume and his lies. Sometimes it was cold justice presenting. Him with evidence, demanding restitution, watching him face consequences. But as I hung up the phone and looked around my workshop at the careful order I'd built, the specialized tools I collected, the certificates on the wall that proved I'd made something of myself despite him, I realized what I really wanted was simpler and more complicated than revenge. Wanted to understand that my mother, Carmen Calderón, had been 36 when she met Julian Hart at a community college poetry reading. She'd been taking night classes, trying to finish the degree she'd abandoned when she got pregnant with me at 19. Dad had died in a construction accident when I was 2, and Mom had spent years cobbling together part-time jobs and artistic projects that never quite paid enough. Julian was everything she thought she needed. Stable income as a high school English teacher, a house in a good neighborhood, someone who quoted Neruda and seemed genuinely interested in our painting. He was 43, never married, charming in that self-deprecating way that made you want to rescue him from his own loneliness. I remember the night she brought him home for dinner. I was 14, suspicious of any man who looked at my mother like she was a problem he could solve. But Julian had done his homework. He asked about my interests, brought me a book of Diane Arbus photographs, listened when I talked about wanting to study art restoration. "Your daughter has excellent taste," he told Mom, and I felt myself soften despite my instincts. The seduction was gradual and thorough. Julian never demanded that Mom stop seeing her friends. He just happened to schedule romantic dinners on the same nights they usually got together. He never criticized her art directly. He just worried aloud about the expense of supplies and whether she was being practical about her future. He never isolated me. He just slowly convinced Mom that I needed more structure, better influences, a firmer hand. Within 6 months, we'd moved into his house, a sprawling colonial with a view of Millfield Harbor that felt like stepping into someone else's life. Mom seemed lighter there, like she was playing the role of the woman she'd always wanted to be. Julian encouraged her to quit her job at the flower shop and focus on her painting, promising that his salary could support all 3 of us. "You should be creating, not arranging other people's flowers," he'd say, and Mom would glow like she'd been waiting her whole life for someone to say those words. I should have seen the trap closing. Should have noticed how Julian always had opinions about Mom's work, suggesting improvements that made her paintings more conventional, steering her away from the abstract pieces that actually showed her talent. Should have caught the way. He rewrote history, convincing Mom that her friends had always been unsupportive, that her family had never really understood her artistic vision. But I was 15, dealing with the awkwardness of a new school and a stepfather who seemed determined to be the parent I'd never asked for. Julian set up a darkroom in the basement for my photography and paid for expensive equipment I couldn't have afforded otherwise. He helped me with college applications, wrote recommendation letters, talked about the importance of having a real career to fall back on. The wedding was small, just Mom, Julian, me, and Victor, who'd been my dad's best friend and had stayed close to our family. I remember Mom in a simple blue dress, looking happier than I'd seen her in years. Julian's vows were beautiful, full of promises about building a life together, about honoring the love that had brought them to this moment. Looking back, I think that was the last day my mother was truly herself. The changes came slowly. Julian started monitoring the household finances more closely, pointing out unnecessary expenses, suggesting that Mom's art supplies budget was getting out of hand. He encouraged her to focus on marketable pieces, landscapes that would appeal to tourists, still lifes that could hang in restaurants. "You have such natural talent," he'd say, looking at one of her experimental pieces with that particular expression that wasn't quite criticism but wasn't support either. "I just want to see you succeed." Mom started second-guessing herself. She'd begin a painting with passion and energy, then abandon it halfway through, convinced it wasn't good enough. She stopped showing her work to anyone, stopped talking about applying to art programs, stopped believing that her vision mattered. I tried to talk to her about it once, during my junior year. We were in the kitchen and she was staring at a canvas she'd been working on for months, a beautiful, haunting piece about loss and memory that captured something true about grief. You should finish it, I said. It's the best thing you've ever done. She looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before, like she was seeing me through someone else's eyes. Julian thinks it's too dark. He says people want art that makes them feel hopeful. Julian doesn't know anything about art, Mom. The words hung between us like a confession. For a moment, I thought she might agree. Might remember who she'd been before Julian's opinions became more important than her own instincts. Instead, she turned away. You don't understand. You're too young to know how hard it is to start over. That conversation haunted me for months. I started paying closer attention to the way Julian spoke to Mom, the way he positioned himself as her protector while systematically undermining her confidence. I noticed how he controlled the money, how he made decisions about our social life, how he developed this habit of speaking for Mom in public as if she couldn't be trusted to represent herself. But I was 17, focused on college applications and my own future. I told myself that Mom was an adult who could make her own choices, that my job was to get out and build my own life. I'd been accepted to several art programs with Julian's help and encouragement. We'd filled out financial aid forms together, calculated costs, made plans. The heart attack came without warning on a Tuesday in March, 3 months before my high school graduation. Mom collapsed in the garden she'd been planting, surrounded by the daffodil bulbs that were finally pushing through the soil. The doctors said it was a congenital condition nobody had detected, the kind of thing that could happen to anyone at any time. But Victor later told me that domestic stress was a significant risk factor for women with heart conditions, and that emotional abuse could trigger cardiac events in vulnerable people. He'd wanted to investigate further, had questions about the medications Julian said Mom had been taking, about the insurance policies that had been updated just months before her death. The funeral was surreal. Julian played the role of the grieving widower, perfectly broken but dignified, devastated by the loss of his beloved wife. People brought casseroles and flowers, told him how sorry they were for his loss, praised him for taking such good care of Carmen and me. I felt like I was watching everything through glass, unable to connect with the narrative everyone else seemed to accept. This wasn't how Mom's story was supposed to end. She was 42, full of unrealized dreams, planning a garden that would bloom without her. 3 days after the funeral, Julian sat me down in his study, the room that had been Mom's art studio, until he convinced her she needed better light. Elsewhere, Zinnia, we need to talk about practical matters. He had papers spread across the desk, insurance documents, financial statements, legal forms I didn't understand. His voice was gentle but firm, the tone he'd used when helping with college applications. Your mother and I had been discussing your future, and we both agreed that the financial burden of college might be too much right now, with the medical bills and funeral expenses, plus the reality of managing this house alone. I think it would be wise to consider more affordable options. I stared at him, not comprehending. We'd already accepted financial aid packages. I had deposits paid, a dorm room assigned, a future mapped out. I don't understand. You said the insurance would cover everything. Julian's expression was patient, almost pitying. Insurance doesn't cover everything, Zinnia. And there are practical considerations you're too young to understand. This house, for instance, it's too big for just the two of us, and the maintenance costs are significant. I've been thinking it might be time to downsize, maybe move somewhere with lower taxes. The word us hit me like a slap. Us. As if my future was still somehow tied to his decisions. As if Mom's death had made him my guardian by default. What are you saying? I'm saying that sometimes life forces us to adjust our expectations. Community college for 2 years, then maybe transfer to a state school. You're smart, Zinnia. You'll find a way to make it work. I thought about Mom's life insurance policy, the one Julian had encouraged her to increase just 6 months earlier. I thought about the college fund my biological father had started, the one Mom had been building since I was born. I thought about all the conversations Julian and I had had about my future, about the importance of education, about the opportunities he wanted to help me achieve. Where's my college fund? The question came out sharper than I'd intended. Julian's patient expression flickered for just a moment, revealing something cold underneath. The fund was in your mother's name, Zinnia. As her husband, I'm the beneficiary of her assets. And given our current financial situation, that money needs to go towards settling debts and managing this transition. I felt the floor shift beneath. Amir, you're stealing my college fund. I'm making responsible decisions during a difficult time. Your mother would want me to take care of both of us, and that means making hard choices about priorities. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but I stopped listening after he used the phrase, "your mother would want," because I knew with the clarity that only comes in moments of complete betrayal, that my mother would never have wanted me to sacrifice my future for Julian's comfort. That night, I called Victor. "Something's wrong," I said and proceeded to tell him about the insurance policies, the college fund, Julian's sudden concerns about money. Victor listened without interrupting, asking careful questions about timelines and documents. "Zinnia, I need you to be very careful. If Julian is planning to disappear, he might be accelerating his timeline. Do you have somewhere safe to stay?" I didn't. Mom's family lived in California, and we'd lost touch over the years. Her friends had gradually been edged out of our lives. Julian had been methodical about isolating us, and I was only beginning to understand how completely. "I'll be okay," I said, though I had no idea if that was true. "I'm going to make some calls. In the meantime, if you can find any financial documents, bank statements, insurance papers, anything with account numbers, it might help us track what's happening to your mother's assets." But when I went to look, everything was gone. The filing cabinet in Julian's study was empty except for household bills and property records. Mom's personal papers, the one she kept in a box in her closet, had vanished. Even her address book, the one with phone numbers for old friends and distant relatives, was nowhere to be found. Julian left on a Thursday morning in May while I was at school. I came home to find a note on the kitchen table and empty rooms that echoed with the absence of everything that had made the house feel like home. The note was brief and formal, like a business memo. "Zinnia, due to financial pressures, I've had to make the difficult decision to sell the house and relocate. I've left $500 in contact information for a social worker who can help you with transitional housing. Your mother's personal effects are in boxes in the garage. This is not how I wanted things to end, but sometimes life forces difficult choices." Julian, I stood in that empty kitchen, holding the note and looking around at the spaces where our life used to be. The refrigerator was gone, along with the washing machine and Mom's good dishes. The walls showed pale rectangles where her paintings had hung, the ones Julian had convinced her to make more marketable. In the garage, I found 3 cardboard boxes labeled Carmen's Things in Julian's neat handwriting. Inside were some of Mom's clothes, a few books, her jewelry box, and a small collection of art supplies. Notably absent were her finished paintings, her photography equipment, and the digital camera she'd used to document her work. Also missing was every financial document, every bank statement, every piece of paper that might have helped me understand what Julian had taken or track where he'd gone. The $500 lasted 2 weeks. The social worker was kind but overworked, with limited options for an 18-year-old who didn't qualify for most assistance programs. I spent the summer couch surfing with classmates whose parents took pity on me, working whatever jobs I could find, trying to figure out how to survive. College was impossible without the financial aid that had been tied to resources I could no longer access. Instead, I got my GED, found a job at a used bookstore, and started learning about antique restoration from the owner, who took an interest in my careful hands and attention to detail. For 10 years, I built a life from nothing. I moved to Boston, apprenticed with master bookbinders, earned certifications, developed a reputation for delicate work that other restorers wouldn't attempt. I lived in tiny apartments and ate ramen more often than I care to remember. But every dollar I saved went into two accounts, one for my future, and one for the day I might find Julian Hart, because I knew he was out there somewhere living off the money he'd stolen from my mother's death, comfortable in whatever new identity he created. I knew he thought he'd gotten away with it, thought he covered his tracks completely. What he didn't know was that some people don't forget. Some people don't move on. Some people spend 10 years getting stronger, smarter, more patient, waiting for the moment when justice becomes possible, and now that moment had finally arrived. The next morning, I closed my workshop, arranged for a colleague to handle my current projects, and drove north toward Maine. Victor's police report sat on my passenger seat, 17 pages of evidence that had been buried 10 years ago, along with contact information for the few people who might remember what Julian Hart had really been. I had questions that needed answers. And this time, Julian wouldn't be disappearing into thin air this time. I was the one with the plan. The brass key felt warm in my palm as I stood before the wrought iron gates of Echo House. Irene. Martel had pressed it into my hand just an hour earlier, her weathered fingers trembling as she whispered, "Third floor, attic door behind the bookshelf." She hid things there, things he never found. Echo House loomed against the October sky like something from a Gothic novel, all weathered. Shingles and tower rooms with gardens that had been left to grow wild. The estate had been built in 1887 by a shipping magnate, and every detail spoke of old money and older secrets. It was exactly the kind of place where a man like Julian would feel comfortable reinventing himself. I'd spent 3 days in Pemaquid. Point before making contact with Irene, 3 days of watching Julian, or Mr. Langley, as he was known here, go about his carefully constructed routine. Morning coffee at the village cafe, where he chatted with locals about weather and fishing reports. Afternoon walks along the cliff tops, always alone, always carrying a leather journal. Evenings spent reading in his cottage, visible through windows that glowed warm and inviting. He looked different, grayer, more weathered, with new lines around his eyes that might have been wisdom or worry. But his movements were the same, that particular way he had of taking up space as if he belonged wherever he was. At 55, Julian Hart had perfected the art of being unremarkable while commanding quiet respect. The plan had been simple: wait for him to leave for his weekly grocery run, then approach the cottage directly. But Irene had intercepted me at the village market, recognizing something in my face that made her pull me aside. "You're here about him," she'd said. Not a question. Irene had worked as Echo House's housekeeper for 5 years, until 2 weeks ago when the new owners had terminated all existing staff. She'd seen Julian's careful performance up close, had noticed inconsistencies in his stories about his past, had been quietly unsettled by the way he sometimes spoke to her when he thought no one was listening. "He's not who he says he is," she'd told me over coffee in her small apartment above the hardware store. Claimed to be a retired professor from Vermont, but he doesn't know basic things about university life. Said he taught literature, but when I mentioned my grandson's favorite book, something any English teacher would recognize, he just nodded along like he'd never heard of it. But it was something else that had made Irene pay attention, something that connected her suspicions to my story in a way that felt like fate. Found a woman's jewelry in his cottage once, when I was cleaning. Beautiful pieces, antique silver and turquoise, the kind of thing that meant something to someone. When I asked about it, he said they'd belonged to his late wife, but the way he said it, she shook her head, like he was reciting lines from a play. My breath had caught. "Can you describe the jewelry?" Silver cuff bracelet with turquoise stones arranged like flower petals, ring with matching stone. There was a necklace, too, with a pendant that looked like a hummingbird. I'd had to grip the edge of the table to keep from crying. Mom's jewelry, the pieces that had been in that small jewelry box in the garage, except they hadn't been. Julian had taken even those, the last tangible connections to who she'd been before he remade her. "There's something else," Irene had said, studying my face. Something I never told anyone because I thought maybe I was being paranoid. But the 3rd floor of Echo House, there's a room up there that he claimed was just storage. Always kept. It locked, said it was full of the previous caretaker's junk. But sometimes I'd see him going up there with papers, staying for hours. She glanced around the coffee shop, then leaned closer. Last week, when I was packing up my things, I went to say goodbye to the house. It's been good to me, that place. And I wanted a moment to remember it properly. Julian was in town, so I thought I'd have time for a quiet walk through. What did you find? The third-floor room wasn't locked. Maybe he forgot, or maybe he figured it didn't matter since he died. Be leaving soon, but inside ... Irene had pulled the brass key from her purse. It wasn't storage. It was set up like an office. File cabinets, computer, boxes of documents. And on the desk, like he'd been looking at them recently, were photographs. Photographs of what? Women. Different women, but they all had this look like they'd been hurt, like they were trying to be brave. There were newspaper clippings, too, about missing persons, about suspicious deaths. I didn't stay long enough to read them all, but I saw enough to know that whatever your Mr. Langley really is, it's not a retired professor. Irene had gripped my hand across the table. I don't know what he did to you, but I know he did something. And that room might have the answers you need. Now I stood before Echo House with her key, my heart hammering against my ribs. The estate was officially sold, but the new owners wouldn't take possession until next month. Julian was spending his final weeks in the cottage, presumably making arrangements for his next disappearance. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The front door was original oak, heavy and imposing. But Irene had told me about the side entrance near the kitchen, the one the staff used. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and I slipped inside. Echo House felt alive around. Full of creaks and whispers that might have been wind or might have been the accumulated weight of a century's worth of secrets. The hallway smelled like lemon oil and old wood, with underlying notes of salt air and something floral I couldn't identify. I made my way through the first floor, marveling at the preservation. Everything was museum-quality Tiffany lamps and Persian rugs, built-in bookcases filled with leather-bound volumes. This was the kind of house my mother would have loved to paint, full of corners where light fell in complicated patterns. The second floor was bedrooms and bathrooms, all decorated in muted colors that suggested expensive taste. But it was the third floor that made my breath catch. The staircase was narrower here, clearly meant for servants in the house's original incarnation. At the top, a long hallway stretched toward the back of the house, lined with doors that probably led to storage spaces and staff quarters. But Irene had been specific. Behind the bookshelf at the end of the hall. The bookshelf was built into the wall, floor to ceiling, filled with what looked like architectural volumes and property records. But when I ran my hands along the edges, I found the hidden mechanism a catch disguised as a decorative molding that released with a soft click. The shelf swung inward, revealing a small room that took my breath away. This wasn't Julian's office. This was something else entirely. The space was maybe 8 feet square, with a slanted ceiling that followed the roofline. But every surface was covered with my mother's work paintings I'd never seen, sketches, photographs, pages of writing. In her distinctive handwriting, there was an easel set up by the window, with a half-finished canvas that showed the view of the harbor from this exact spot. I moved deeper into the room, touching things with shaking hands. Here was Mom's missing digital camera, sitting on a small desk next to stacks of printed photographs. Here were her art supplies, the expensive brushes and paints Julian had said were too costly, the specialized papers she'd been told to save for special projects. And here, in a wooden crate beneath the window, were dozens of cassette tapes labeled in Mom's handwriting with dates from the last year of her life. Picked up one labeled March 15th and noticed there was a small tape player on the desk. With trembling fingers, I inserted the tape and pressed play. My mother's voice filled the room, clear and determined in a way I hadn't heard for years. This is Carmen Calderón, and today is March 15th. I'm recording this because I need to remember. What really happened, not the version Julian will try to convince me of later. This morning he told me that my paintings were becoming too personal, that I was letting my emotions get in the way of creating marketable work. He suggested I focus on safer subjects, flowers, landscapes, things that wouldn't upset potential buyers. I sank into the chair by the desk, my legs suddenly unsteady. But that's not what this is really about. This is about control. Julian needs me to doubt myself, needs me to believe that my vision isn't trustworthy. Because if I start trusting my own eyes, I might notice things he doesn't want me to see. The recording continued for 20 minutes, documenting a conversation I'd never heard about. revealing a version of my mother I'd forgotten existed. This was the woman who'd raised me for 14 years, the one who'd been confident in her own judgment, who trusted her instincts about people and art and life. I know he's hiding money from me. I found bank statements in his briefcase last week, accounts I didn't know existed, deposits that don't match his salary. When I asked about them, he said I was being paranoid, that grief was making me imagine problems that didn't exist. Grief, but my father had been dead for years by then. What grief was Julian using to gaslight my mother? He keeps talking about Zinnia's future, about the importance of being practical about college expenses. But I set up that fund when she was 2 years old. I've been adding to it for 16 years. There should be enough money for any school she wants to attend, plus graduate school if she chooses. So why is Julian suddenly concerned about costs? I stopped the tape, my hands shaking too badly to continue. She'd known. Mom had known Julian was stealing from us, had been documenting his manipulation, had been fighting back in ways I'd never seen. Why hadn't she said anything to me? Why had she suffered in silence while I'd assumed she was just becoming weaker, more dependent, less like herself? I looked around the room again, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't just a hiding place, it was a sanctuary. A space where Mom could be herself, could create without Julian's opinions and corrections, could think clearly about what was happening to our family. There were more tapes, dozens of them, spanning the entire last year of her life. There were paintings I'd never seen, including the one she'd been working on in the kitchen that day in the dark. Beautiful piece about loss and memory that Julian had convinced her to abandon, except she hadn't abandoned it. She'd finished it. Here in secret, and it was extraordinary. I spent 2 hours in that room, listening to tapes and looking through Mom's hidden work. The portrait that emerged was devastating and empowering at the same time. My mother had been fighting, had been documenting Julian's abuse, had been protecting me in ways I'd never understood. But she'd also been trapped financially, dependent on a man who controlled every aspect of their shared life, isolated from the support systems that might have helped her leave, convinced that her primary responsibility was to keep me safe, even if it meant sacrificing herself. The final tape was labeled the day before, and I almost couldn't bring myself to play it. If something happens to me, Mom's voice was different now, tired but resolved. I need Zinnia to know that I tried. I need her to know that I loved her enough to document the truth, even if I wasn't brave enough to act on it. Julian has been putting something in my tea. I've been feeling dizzy, confused, having heart palpitations that the doctor says are stress-related. But the symptoms only happen after our evening conversations, after he brings me that special chamomile blend he says will help me sleep. My blood turned to ice. I've been pretending to drink it, then dumping it in the sink when he's not looking. The symptoms have stopped, but Julian keeps asking if I'm feeling better, if the tea is helping. He seems disappointed when I say yes. I've hidden samples in the freezer behind the ice trays. If something happens to me, if this recording is found, please have them tested. I think Julian is trying to trigger a cardiac event. My mother died of heart failure when she was 45. Julian knows about the family history. He's been asking questions about my symptoms, encouraging me to skip doctor's appointments, telling me that stress tests are unnecessary for someone my age. The recording continued with details that made me sick. Julian's research into heart medications, his questions about my mother's life insurance, his subtle encouragement of habits that would worsen her condition. But here's what Julian doesn't know. Mom's voice grew stronger. I've been making copies of everything. Bank records, insurance documents, the contents of his private files. It's all here in this room, along with my testimony. If he succeeds in killing me, at least there will be evidence. I love you, Zinnia. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to protect us both, but maybe this will be enough to protect you. I sat in silence for a long time after the tape ended, surrounded by the evidence of my mother's secret courage. She'd known Julian was planning to murder her, and she'd spent her final months building a case against him while pretending to be the weak, compliant wife he needed her to be. But where were the financial documents she'd mentioned? Where were the copies of Julian's files? I spent another hour searching the room, finally finding a loose floorboard beneath the easel. Inside was a metal box containing everything Mom had promised: bank statements showing Julian's theft, insurance documents he forged, medical records he'd altered, and photocopies of what looked like similar documents for other women. Julian Hart wasn't just a con man who targeted my mother. He was a serial predator with a pattern going back decades. The other women in those photographs Irene had seen, they weren't random victims. They were marks in a long-term strategy of financial and emotional abuse, and from the looks of the medical records, at least 3 of them had died of heart-related complications shortly before Julian disappeared from their lives. I photographed everything with my phone, then carefully returned the documents to their hiding place. But I kept one thing, a cassette tape labeled for Zinnia in my mother's handwriting dot. As I prepared to leave Echo House, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 10 years, complete clarity about what needed to happen next. Julian Hart thought he'd gotten away with murder. He'd spent a decade living comfortably off the money he'd stolen from my mother's death, never imagining that she'd been documenting his crimes, never suspecting that someday her daughter would find the evidence and bring it home. But I wasn't going to the police. Not yet. First, I was going to knock on his door and let him know that his past had finally caught up with him. I was going to look him in the eye and watch his face when he realized that some secrets don't stay buried forever, and then I was going to give him a choice: confess everything and face the consequences, or spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, knowing that I had enough evidence to destroy him whenever I chose. Either way, Julian Hart's comfortable new life was about to end. The cassette tape my mother had labeled for Zinnia played in my car as I drove back toward Julian's cottage. Her voice was steady, deliberate, like she was trying to pack a lifetime of love and wisdom into 30 minutes. My beautiful daughter, if you're hearing this, it means I didn't find the courage to leave Julian before it was too late. It means I chose to protect you in the only way I knew how, by documenting the truth and trusting that someday you'd be strong enough to use it. I had to pull over, my vision blurred with tears I'd been holding back for hours. I know you probably think I was weak, that I let him control me, that I gave up fighting. But everything I did in those final months was about keeping you safe. Julian had threatened to make sure you never got into college, never had access to any financial aid if I tried to leave him. He showed me legal documents that would have made me look unstable, unfit. He convinced me that your only chance at a future was through him. The recording revealed the depth of Julian's manipulation in ways that made my stomach turn. He'd isolated my mother not just emotionally, but legally and financially, creating a web of dependence that made escape seem impossible. But I was documenting everything, building a case that would protect you even if I couldn't protect myself. Every conversation, every threat, every piece of evidence about what he was really doing. I hid it all in Echo House because I knew he'd never think to look there. Men like Julian don't believe women are capable of that kind of strategic thinking. My mother's voice carried a bitter satisfaction that I'd never heard when she was alive. The room in Echo House isn't just evidence, Zinnia. It's a roadmap. Everything you need to expose him, to recover what he stole, to make sure he can't do this to another family. But more than that, it's proof that you come from a long line of survivors. Your grandmother survived the Depression and an abusive first marriage. I survived being a single mother and then Julian's psychological torture. And you, my darling, you'll survive this too. The tape continued with specific instructions, bank account numbers Julian didn't know she discovered, contacts who might help, details about his previous identities and victims. But it was the final section that broke my heart completely. I need you to know that choosing to stay wasn't about giving up. It was about buying me time to become strong enough to finish what I started. I knew Julian would disappear after my death, knew he'd take everything and leave you with nothing. But I also knew that you're smarter than he is, more patient, more determined. I knew that someday you'd find this evidence and use it to get justice not just for me, but for all of us. Don't let guilt eat you alive, Zinnia. Don't waste years wondering if you could have saved me. The truth is, I was already dying not from my heart condition, but from the slow poison of living with a man who wanted to erase everything I was. At least this way, my death serves a purpose. At least this way, you get to be the one who brings him down. By the time the tape ended, I was sobbing in my parked car, grieving not just for my mother's death, but for the years I'd spent believing she'd given up. She hadn't been weak, she'd been playing a longer game than I'd understood, sacrificing herself to ensure that someday justice would be possible. The sun was setting as I drove through Pemaquid Point's quiets toward Julian's cottage. The village had that off-season emptiness that coastal Maine towns get in October. Most of the tourist shops closed, restaurants operating on reduced hours, a peaceful quality that would have been soothing under different circumstances. Julian's cottage sat at the edge of Echo House's property, a charming stone building that looked like something from an English countryside postcard. Warm light glowed from the windows, and I could see a silhouette moving around inside, probably preparing dinner like any normal person ending any normal day. But there was nothing normal about Julian Hart, and after listening to my mother's tape, I understood just how calculated every aspect of his performance really was. The cottage, the quiet lifestyle, the friendly interactions with locals. It was all part of an elaborate disguise designed to hide the fact that he was a predator who'd spent decades destroying women's lives. I parked across the street and sat, for a moment, gathering my courage. For 10 years, I'd imagined this confrontation, but now that it was here, I felt the weight of everything my mother had entrusted to me. This wasn't just about getting answers anymore, it was about ending a pattern that had destroyed multiple families. About making sure Julian's victims hadn't died in vain. The front door was painted deep blue with a brass knocker shaped like an anchor. Very nautical, very Maine, very carefully chosen to blend in with local expectations. I raised my hand and knocked 3 times, firm and deliberate. Footsteps approached, and then the door opened to reveal Julian Hart for the first time in 10 years. He looked exactly like himself and nothing like himself at the same time. The basics were the same: tall, lean build, silver hair, those pale blue eyes that had once seemed so trustworthy. But there were new lines around his mouth, a softness around his middle that suggested comfortable living, and something in his expression that I couldn't quite identify. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I watched his face cycle through confusion, recognition, and what might have been fear before settling into a mask of polite surprise. "Zinnia," he said, and his voice was exactly the same warm, cultured, the tone he'd used when helping me with homework. My goodness, what a surprise. He didn't ask how I'd found him, didn't pretend not to know who I was, didn't try to maintain. His Robert Langley cover, that told me everything I needed to know about how well he'd been prepared for this moment. "Hello, Julian." We stood there for another beat, the weight of 10 years and everything unsaid hanging between us. Then Julian stepped back and gestured for me to come inside. "Please, come in. You must be tired from your drive." The cottage's interior was exactly what I'd expected: comfortable furniture in muted colors, bookshelves filled with classics, art on the walls that looked expensive but not too personal. It was the home of a cultured, educated man with refined taste and no particular attachments. In other words, a perfect facade. "Can I offer you something? Coffee? Tea?" The word tea hit me like a physical blow, bringing back the memory of my mother's recording. I must have flinched, because Julian's expression sharpened for just a moment before returning to polite concern. "Just water, please." He moved to the kitchen, giving me a chance to look around. The living room was spotless, organized, revealing. Nothing personal beyond the carefully curated book selection. But on a side table, I spotted something that made my breath catch: my mother's turquoise bracelet, displayed casually as if it were a piece of decorative art he picked up at an antique shop. Julian returned with a glass of water and settled into the chair across from me, his posture relaxed but alert. He was studying my face the way he used to when I was struggling with a difficult concept in school, trying to assess how much I understood. "You look well," he said. "I've wondered over the years how you were managing." The casual concern in his voice made me want to scream. This man had stolen my future, murdered my mother, destroyed our lives, and he was sitting there making polite conversation, as if we were distant relatives catching up at a reunion. "Have you?" I kept my voice level, conversational. "Wondered?" "About me, of course. You were always such a bright girl. I hoped you'd found a way to land on your feet. No thanks to you." Julian's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "I'm sorry things ended the way they did, Zinnia. Your mother's death was ... unexpected. I was grieving, not thinking clearly about practical matters. Perhaps I could have handled the transition better." It was masterful, the way he acknowledged fault without admitting to anything specific. Julian had always been skilled at threading that needle, accepting just enough responsibility to seem reasonable while deflecting any real accountability. "Is that what you call it? A transition?" "What would you call it?" I looked at him sitting there in his comfortable chair, wearing a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than I used to make in a month, surrounded by the material comfort he'd purchased with my mother's life insurance money. Theft, fraud, murder. The words hung in the air between us. Julian's face remained perfectly composed, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that meant I surprised him. Those are serious accusations, Zinnia. I hope you haven't been carrying that kind of anger for 10 years. It's not healthy. You're right. Anger isn't healthy. That's why I'm here. Julian leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting to something. That might have been genuine curiosity. What do you want? It was the question I'd been preparing for, but sitting across from him in his stolen comfort, I realized I wanted more than I originally planned. I want you to tell me why. Why what? Why my mother? Why us? Why you chose to destroy our family when you could have just left. Julian was quiet for a long moment, and for the first time since I'd arrived, his mask slipped slightly. I saw something underneath, not remorse, exactly, but a kind of weariness that suggested this conversation wasn't entirely unexpected. Your mother was ... double quotes. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Carmen was a very special woman. Talented, beautiful, trusting, perhaps too trusting. You mean easy to manipulate. I mean vulnerable. She'd been alone for a long time, struggling financially, raising you by herself. She wanted stability, security, someone to take care of practical matters so she could focus on her art. Julian's voice took on the reasonable tone he used when explaining why Mom's paintings needed to be more marketable, why her friends were bad influences, why her instincts couldn't be trusted. And you were happy to provide that, for a price. I provided exactly what she asked for. A stable home, financial security, someone who appreciated her talents and encouraged her to pursue them. I thought about the hidden room in Echo House, about my mother's secret recordings documenting Julian's systematic destruction of her confidence and independence. Is that what you call it when you convince someone their own judgment is worthless? When you isolate them from everyone who might support them? When you poison their tea to trigger a heart attack? This time, Julian's composure cracked completely. His face went pale, and for just a moment, I saw something like panic in his eyes. I don't know what you think you know. I know everything. I reached into my purse and pulled out one of the cassette tapes, setting it on the coffee table between. U.S. Everything, Julian. Every conversation, every threat, every lie you told. She documented it all. Julian stared at the tape like it was a snake that might strike at any moment. When he looked back at me, his expression had changed completely. Mask was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. Where did you find that? Does it matter? The point is, I have it. I have all of them. Plus the financial records, the medical evidence, the proof that you've done this before. Julian stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked Echo House. His hands were clasped behind his back, and I could see tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there moments before. What do you want, Zinnia? The question came out differently. This time sharper with no pretense of warmth or concern. This was the real Julian Hart, the one my mother had been afraid to confront directly. I want the truth. All of it. I want to understand why you chose us, how you've gotten away with this for so long, what you were planning to do next. And then we'll see. Julian turned back to face me, and for the first time since I'd knocked on his door, I felt a flicker of fear. This wasn't the charming stepfather who'd helped me with college applications. This was the predator my mother had been documenting, the man who killed her when she got too close to exposing him. You think you can waltz in here after 10 years and threaten me? His voice was still quiet, but there was something dangerous underneath. You think you can use your dead mother's paranoid fantasies too? They weren't fantasies. I kept my voice steady, though my heart was racing. The tea samples. She saved them. They tested positive for digitalis, enough to trigger cardiac arrhythmia in someone with her condition. Julian went very still. You had them tested? Victor Malden never stopped investigating. He just had to wait for the right evidence. It was a bluff. Victor didn't have the tea samples, and I wasn't even sure they'd still be viable after 10 years. But Julian didn't know that, and the fear in his eyes told me I'd hit something important. Victor Malden is a washed-up ex-cop with a grudge. Victor Malden is the reason you're not going to disappear again. We stared at each other across the cottage's comfortable living room, and I felt the shift in dynamic that happens when predators realize their prey has teeth. Julian was reevaluating me, trying to figure out how much of a threat I actually posed. What do you want? He asked again, but this time it sounded like a negotiation. I want to understand the pattern. I want to know about the other women. Julian's jaw tightened. I don't know what you're talking about. Patricia Chambers in Vermont died of heart failure 6 months after you disappeared with her savings. Margaret Torres in New Hampshire. Similar story, similar timeline. Should I keep going? The names came from the documents I'd found in my mother's hidden room, part of her research into Julian's background. I'd spent the afternoon cross-referencing death certificates and missing person reports, building a picture of a man who'd spent decades perfecting his technique. Julian moved back to his chair, his movements more careful now, more calculated. He was thinking, weighing options, trying to figure out how to regain control of the situation. You're talking about coincidences. Older women with health problems die. It's unfortunate, but it's not criminal. 4 women, Julian. 4 women, who all happened to die of heart-related issues within months of you gaining access to their finances. 4 women who all happened to have daughters or nieces who were cut out of their inheritance. 4 women who trusted the wrong person to manage their affairs. If you're suggesting I somehow caused their deaths, I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts. You're a serial killer who targets vulnerable women, gains their trust, isolates them from their support systems, and then murders them for their money. The words hung in the air like an accusation, but couldn't be taken back. Julian was very quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, colder, more controlled. Prove it. 2 words, but they contained a challenge that made my blood run cold. Because Julian was right having evidence, and being able to use it were 2 different things. My mother's recordings documented emotional abuse, but proving murder would require more than cassette tapes and saved T samples. I will. No, you won't. Julian's confidence was returning, and I could see him reassessing the situation, realizing that maybe I wasn't as much of a threat as he'd initially thought. Because if you had proof, you wouldn't be here talking to me. You'd be talking to the police. He was right, and we both knew it. But he didn't know everything I'd found in that hidden room. Didn't know about Victor's original investigation. Didn't know that I'd spent 10 years planning for this moment. Maybe I don't want the police involved yet. Maybe I want something else first, such as... I stood up, moving to the side table where my mother's bracelet sat displayed like a trophy. I picked it up, feeling the familiar weight of the silver and turquoise that had adorned her wrist for as long as I could remember. I want my inheritance back. All of it. Julian actually laughed a short, harsh sound that held no humor. Your inheritance? Zinnia, your mother died with debts. The house was mortgaged, there were medical bills, funeral expenses. Whatever money she'd saved went to cover legitimate costs. Liar. Check the public records. The house sold for exactly what was owed on it. The insurance money went to final expenses. There was nothing left over. He was probably right about the public records. Julian was too smart to leave obvious trails. But my mother's hidden documents told a different story, one that showed systematic financial manipulation going back months before her death. What about the college fund? What college fund? The one Mom had been building since I was 2. The one that should have been worth over $60,000 by the time I graduated. Julian's expression was perfectly blank. I don't know anything about a college fund, but I caught the slight flutter of his left eyelid a tell I remembered from when he used to help me with math homework and I'd give a wrong answer. Julian might be a skilled manipulator, but he wasn't perfect. Really? Because I have bank statements that show regular deposits into an education savings account right up until the month you convinced Mom to transfer all her assets into your joint accounts. If such an account existed, it would have been part of your mother's estate, which, as I've explained, was insufficient to cover her debts. We were going in circles, with Julian denying everything while I pushed for admissions he'd never give. But the conversation was serving a purpose. I was learning things about how his mind worked, about the stories he told himself to justify what he'd done. Tell me about Patricia Chambers. The sudden change of subject made Julian blank. I don't know anyone by that name. Vermont school teacher. Widowed at 53, one daughter who lived in California. You dated her for 8 months before she died of heart failure. Ring any bells? You're confused. Am I? Because I have photos of you 2 together at a faculty Christmas party. You were calling yourself James Fletcher then, working as a substitute teacher while you gained her trust. Julian went very still again, and I knew I'd hit something significant. The photos had been part of my mother's research. along with copies of newspaper articles about Patricia's suspicious death. Where did you get photos? Does it matter? The point is, I have them. Just like I have documentation about Margaret Torres, Sarah Chen, and Elena Vasquez. You've been busy, Julian. 4 dead women in 15 years, all with the same pattern of isolation, financial manipulation, and convenient heart failure. Julian stood abruptly, moving toward the kitchen. For a moment, I thought he might be going for a weapon, but he just stood there with his back to me, hands gripping the counter. You don't understand. Gonna explain it to me. When he turned around, his expression was different, not the polite mask or the cold calculation, but something that might have been genuine emotion. They were lonely, all of them. Desperate for someone to care about them, to make them feel valuable again. They wanted to be taken care of, so he took care of them. To death, I gave them what they wanted. Companionship, security, someone who appreciated them for who they were, until you didn't need them anymore. Julian's jaw worked like he was chewing words he couldn't quite bring himself to say. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more thoughtful. Death comes to everyone, Zinnia. I didn't cause it. I just ... Positioned myself to benefit when it arrived. The casual way he said it made my skin crawl. This wasn't a man who'd made a mistake or gotten it over his head. This was someone who'd turned murder into a business model, who'd spent decades refining his technique for targeting and destroying vulnerable women. And my mother? Was she just positioning herself to die, too? Your mother was different. How? Julian! Was quiet for so long that I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something that might have been regret. She fought back. 3 words that revealed everything about why my mother had died, and why Julian had been so determined to erase our family completely. She hadn't been the compliant victim he'd expected. She'd been documenting his crimes, building a case against him, preparing to expose him so he'd killed her before she could. She fought back. Julian's words hung between us, and for the first time since I'd knocked on his door, there was a flicker of genuine emotion in his voice. Not remorse. Julian Hart wasn't capable of remorse, but something like frustration or wounded pride. The others were grateful, he went on, moving to his chair but not sitting. He gripped the back like it was an anchor. Patricia, Margaret, Elena, they appreciated what I offered. Stability, companionship. Someone who saw their value when the world stopped seeing them. I thought of the women in my mother's research, middle-aged, recently widowed or divorced, financially vulnerable. Perfect targets for a predator who packaged manipulation as romance. And when they got suspicious, missing money, changed wills, Julian's grip tightened. They didn't ask questions. They trusted me, because you left them no choice. I made them feel desired. Do you know what it's like for a woman at that age to feel invisible? To lose a husband and half her social circle? To become an afterthought to her own children? Julian's voice had taken on the cadence of a sales pitch, the same one I imagined he'd used on every one of his victims. I gave them purpose. When Patricia met me, she was grading papers alone, eating frozen dinners. After we met, she started hosting dinners, planning trips, painting again. Until she died peacefully, he said. Feeling loved. The way he said it, like he'd given Patricia a gift, turned my stomach. But it revealed something. Julian believed his presence justified everything he took. Except she didn't die peacefully, did she? Heart failure is terrifying, especially when it's caused by someone slowly poisoning you. Julian's expression hardened. I never hurt anyone unnecessarily. Meaning you did when it suited you. I gave them comfort. Support, the kind they would never have had without me. And my mother? Where did she fit into this charity? Frustration flashed in his eyes. Carmen was supposed to be different. Talented, unsure, raising a teenager alone. She had everything I needed. And real artistic talent. I thought she might be a long-term investment. The clinical way he described her made me sick. She was never a person to him. She was a portfolio. What changed? She started questioning things, bills, friends avoiding her, why I cared so much. About her financial history. I tried redirecting her. Suggested new art projects. Blamed stress. But she didn't stop. No, she hid things. Made calls when she thought I wasn't listening. Asked her doctor about symptoms that didn't match any real condition. She was documenting everything, building a case. She was paranoid. Spinning conspiracies. I even looked into medication to help her anxiety. Digitalis? Medication to help her trust me. Stop seeing threats where there weren't any. But the threats were real. You were stealing from her. I was managing our finances without honesty. I gave her 2 years of peace, 2 years to focus on her art, until you decided it was time for her to die, until she stopped fighting and trusted me. Even as he spoke, I could see the lie in his eyes. He planned her death. I'd seen the insurance documents, the changes to her will, the medical research she'd done within months of marrying her. Show me your teaching portfolio, I said suddenly. What? The one that proves you were a teacher before becoming a professional widow killer. Irene Martel mentioned seeing something. She's a disturbed woman who was fired for theft. And you're accusing someone else of theft? Julian's deflection told me what I needed. His past was fabricated. What's your real name, Julian? You know my name. I know the one you used to marry my mother. But what's on your birth certificate? Silence. Names are just labels. No, they're accountability. And that's what you want? Justice? I want the truth, all of it. And I want you to confess. And if I refuse, then I take what I have to the police. You have speculation. I have more. I reached into my bag and pulled out a photograph, Julian, arm around Patricia Chambers, smiling. Like photographic evidence linking you to multiple victims. Julian glanced at the photo, and I saw recognition flicker across his face before he controlled his expression. That could be anyone. Could be, but it's not. It's you 15 years ago, calling yourself James Fletcher, courting a woman who died 6 months later under suspicious circumstances. 15 years is a long time. People change, memories fade, resemblances can be deceiving. True, but dental records don't lie. Fingerprints don't change. DNA is forever. Julian went very still, and I knew I'd finally said something that genuinely scared him. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that if I wanted to prove your identity, there are ways to do it that don't depend on your cooperation. It was mostly a bluff. I didn't have access to Julian's DNA or fingerprints, and I had no idea what kind of official records might still exist from his previous identities. But the threat was enough to shift the dynamic in the room, to remind Julian that he wasn't completely in control of this situation. You're talking about harassment? I'm talking about investigation. The kind that should have happened 10 years ago if certain people hadn't been pressured to close cases prematurely. Julian's expression sharpened. Victor Malden filled your head with conspiracy theories. Victor Malden did his job. He investigated suspicious deaths and followed the evidence wherever it led. If that threatens certain people with connections to local politics and business interests, well, that's what happens when you do real police work. I was fishing now, trying to understand why Victor's original investigation had been shut down so quickly. But Julian's reaction told me I was close to something important. Victor was a drunk with a grudge against authority. Victor was a good cop who asked inconvenient questions about powerful people. What powerful people? I was a high school teacher. Were you? Or were you someone else entirely? Someone with enough connections to make problems disappear and investigations go away? Julian was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, colder, more controlled. You're fishing, Zinnia. You don't know anything about powerful connections or political pressure. You're a book restorer from Boston, who's been fed conspiracy theories by a washed-up ex-cop with too much time on his hands. But the way he said it with just a bit too much emphasis, too much specificity, told me I hit something real. Julian did have connections, had somehow managed to shut down official investigations into his activities. That suggested resources and influence beyond what a simple con man should have been able to access. Who's protecting you, Julian? No one needs to protect me. I haven't done anything wrong. Then why have you spent 10 years living under an assumed name? Because I wanted privacy after a traumatic loss. Because starting over sometimes requires leaving the past behind. Or because you needed to disappear before anyone figured out that you'd murdered your wife and stolen her daughter's inheritance. We stared at each other across the cottage's comfortable living room, and I felt like we were finally getting close to the truth, not just about what Julian had done, but about how he'd managed to do it for so long without facing consequences. What do you want, Zinnia? Julian asked for the third time, but now it sounded less like curiosity and more like negotiation. I told you I want confession and accountability. And if I were to provide that, if I were to acknowledge certain mistakes in judgment, What would you be willing to offer in return? I hadn't expected Julian to move toward negotiations so quickly, and the shift made me wary. Men like Julian didn't give up easily. If he was considering confession, it was because he thought he could control the terms or find a way to minimize the consequences. What kind of mistakes are we talking about? Poor financial decisions. Relationship choices that weren't in everyone's best interest. Perhaps some legal and ethical shortcuts that seemed justified at the time, but might appear questionable in retrospect. Julian was trying to reframe murder and theft as mere lapses in judgment, minor infractions that could be resolved through the right kind of plea bargain. But I could hear the calculation in his voice, the way he was testing different narratives to see which one I might accept. I'm not interested in euphemisms, Julian. If you want to negotiate, you need to be specific about what you're admitting to. And you need to be specific about what you're offering. The conversation was turning into exactly the kind of chess match I'd been dreading. Julian trying to minimize his exposure while I pushed for maximum accountability. But I was beginning to realize that simple confession might not be enough. Julian was too practiced at manipulation, too skilled at finding ways to escape consequences. What I really wanted was to understand not just what he'd done, but how he'd done it and how to make sure he could never do it again. I want to see your real teaching portfolio, I said suddenly. Julian blinked. Why? Because I think your entire professional background is fabricated. I think Julian Hart is just another alias, and I want to know who you really are. For the first time since I'd arrived, Julian looked genuinely uncertain, like I'd asked for something he hadn't prepared for. That's an unusual request. It's a simple request. If you were really a high school English teacher for 20 years, you'd have documentation. Lesson plans, student evaluations, photos from faculty events. Basic professional records that any teacher would keep. I don't see how my employment history is relevant to. It's relevant because I think you've been running this con for longer than anyone realizes. I think you've been using fake credentials to gain access to educational institutions, using your position to identify and target vulnerable women in the community. Julian was very quiet, and I could see him weighing how much truth he could afford to reveal without completely undermining his position. Even if that were true, which I'm not saying it wouldn't prove anything about the specific allegations you're making. No, but it would establish a pattern of deception that goes back decades. It would show that you're not just someone who made some bad choices after my mother's death. You're a career criminal who's been perfecting this technique for most of your adult life. Julian moved back to the window, and I could see tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, measured. Hypothetically, if someone had created certain professional credentials that weren't entirely accurate, that would be a matter for academic institutions to address. It wouldn't be evidence of violent crime. Hypothetically, if someone had been using fake credentials to access vulnerable populations for 30 years, that would suggest premeditation and sophistication that prosecutors love to argue when they're pushing for maximum sentences. We stared at each other in silence, and I felt the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. Julian was beginning to realize that I'd done more research than he'd anticipated, that I understood not just what he'd done, but the systematic way he'd done it. What do you want, Zinnia? He asked again, but this time it sounded like surrender. Before I could answer, my phone rang. Victor's name appeared on the screen, and I felt a flutter of anxiety. He wasn't supposed to call unless there was an emergency. I need to take this, I said, stepping toward the cottage's front door. Zinnia. Victor's voice was tense, urgent. Where are you? At Julian's cottage. Why? You need to leave. No. I just got word that someone's been asking questions about our investigation. Official questions from people with federal credentials. My blood turned to ice. What kind of questions? The kind that suggests Julian Hart has protection at a level we didn't anticipate. The kind that means if you're with him right now, you might be in more danger than we realized. I glanced back at Julian, who was watching me from across the room with an expression I couldn't read. I'm okay. But Victor, I need you to. The line went dead. I stared at my phone, trying to process what Victor had said about federal credentials and protection. When I looked up, Julian was standing closer than he'd been before. Close enough that I could see something new in his expression, not fear or calculation, but a kind of cold satisfaction. Problem? He asked, and his voice was different now, carrying an authority that hadn't been there before. No problem. But as I said it, I realized that I might have miscalculated badly. I'd come here expecting to confront a serial killer hiding in plain sight. Instead, I might have walked into something much more dangerous and much more protected than I'd ever imagined. Federal credentials, Victor had said. And now Julian looked at me with something that made my skin crawl, not the panic of a cornered predator, but the calm confidence of someone expecting backup. You should sit down, Zinnia. His voice was different now. Colder. Commanding. I think I'll stand. I think you'll sit. Something in his tone made me obey before I'd even decided to. Julian wasn't asking. He was giving orders he expected to be followed. Victor's been asking the wrong questions, Julian said, settling into his chair. Questions about federal protection programs, classified operations, things that aren't his concern. What are you talking about? You've spent 10 years building a fantasy, but the truth is more complicated than your grieving daughter narrative. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek foam military grade, not the burner I'd seen before. My name isn't Julian Hart, he said. Or James Fletcher or Robert Langley. My real name is classified. My job requires deep cover while investigating criminal enterprises, money laundering, fraud. Sometimes that means long-term relationships. You're claiming to be a federal agent? I'm claiming I was assigned to investigate women connected to organized crime. Patricia Chambers was laundering money. Margaret Torres ran an illegal gambling ring. Your mother, well, she was being used to hide assets left behind by your father's business associates. That's impossible. Is it? How much did you really know about your father's construction contracts? Or why people still needed access to his records years after his death? Julian put the phone to his ear. I caught fragments. Package delivered. Need cleanup support. He hung up. Your mother started asking questions. He continued. About bank accounts. About money linked to shell companies. I was sent to determine if she was involved or just a useful idiot. I stared at him. You're lying. Then explain why I've never been arrested. Why every inquiry into me gets shut down. Why I can use multiple identities without triggering background checks. Julian stood and opened a cabinet I hadn't noticed. He dropped a manila folder onto the coffee table. Explain this. Inside were surveillance photos, my mother meeting with men I didn't know. Documents tied to accounts I'd never seen. Transactions far beyond what a part-time florist should have handled. My father was a contractor who took money from the wrong people. After he died, your mother inherited more than just his truck. She didn't know, not at first. But once she did, certain people got nervous. Julian's phone buzzed again. His eyes flicked to the screen. He looked back at me with something close to pity. Your mother died of stress-related heart failure, not murder. I was there to assess her cooperation. When she died, my assignment ended. Then, why? Steal everything? Why disappear? Because my cover wasn't needed anymore. I don't believe you. You don't have to. But in 20 minutes, federal agents will be here to debrief you. Tell them about serial killers and stolen inheritances. See how that aligns with national security. The room tilted. Julian was rewriting everything I thought I knew, but something felt off. Too convenient. Too neat. Show me your credentials. They're classified. Show me something. I don't owe you proof, Zinnia. You're a civilian interfering with federal operations. Then arrest me. What? If I've crossed a line, arrest me, read me my rights. Julian hesitated. Just for a moment. That's not how this works. Then call your supervisor. I'll wait. Julian shifted by the door. I realized waiting was the most dangerous thing I could do. If he was a federal agent, I'd disappear. If he wasn't, whatever was coming next wouldn't be sanctioned out. My phone buzzed. A message from Victor. Don't trust him. Working on extraction. Stay alive. Julian held out his hand. Give me the phone. No. It's evidence in an ongoing investigation. What investigation? Victor Malden's criminal interference with federal operations. His story was unraveling even as it expanded. I want a lawyer. You'll talk to one after the debriefing. I want one now. Julian's mask cracked again. Beneath it, cold calculation. You've created security risks. That information needs to be contained. His phone buzzed. His eyes narrowed. They're here. Outside, I heard footsteps on the walkway. Julian moved to the door. His hand was on the handle. Zinnia, I need you to remain calm and cooperate fully with the agents who are about to debrief you. Answer their questions honestly, provide them with any materials you've collected during your investigation, and don't attempt to contact Victor Malden or anyone else until the situation has been resolved. And if I refuse, then you'll be detained until you're willing to cooperate. The footsteps stopped outside the front door, and I heard a brief, quiet conversation that I couldn't quite make out. Julian nodded to someone outside, then turned back to me. Last chance to make this easy on yourself. I looked around the cottage, trying to assess my options. The back door was probably locked, the windows were small and high, and I had no idea how many people were outside or what kind of resources they had. But I also had something Julian didn't know about my mother's final recording, the one she made the day before she died, the one that contained information I hadn't shared with anyone yet. Before your colleagues come in, I said, there is something you should know. Julian paused with his hand on the door handle. What? My mother didn't just document your activities in those final months. She documented something else. Something that proves you're not who you claim to be. What are you talking about? She recorded a conversation she overheard between you and someone else. A conversation about previous assignments, about other women you killed, about the network of people who've been helping you operate without detection for decades. Julian's face went very pale. That's impossible. Is it? Because according to that recording, you're not a federal agent investigating my mother's criminal activities. You're part of a private organization that specializes in targeting and eliminating people who stumble onto certain types of information. My mother's death wasn't natural causes or federal containment. It was a professional assassination disguised as a heart attack. The lie came out smoothly, convincingly, and I could see it hit Julian like a physical blow. He stepped away from the door, his hand dropping to his side. Where is this recording? Somewhere safe. Somewhere your federal friends will never find it unless I choose to share it. You're bluffing. Maybe, but are you willing to bet your freedom on it? Because if that recording becomes public, your entire federal agent story falls apart, and everyone you've worked with becomes exposed. Julian stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him trying to calculate whether I was telling the truth. The footsteps outside had stopped, and I had the sense that whoever was waiting was growing. Impatient. What do you want? Julian asked for the fourth time, but now it sounded like desperation. I want the truth. All of it. About who you really are, who you work for, what really happened to my mother. And if I tell you, then maybe we can figure out a way for both of us to walk away from this situation alive. Julian was quiet for another moment, then moved away from the door toward the center of the room. You're right, he said quietly. I'm not a federal agent. Julian's admission hung in the air like a confession that changed everything and nothing. He wasn't a federal agent, but that didn't make him the serial killer I'd feared either. As he stepped away from the door, I saw him weighing how much truth he could afford to reveal. Then who are you? Someone who works for people who prefer to remain invisible, Julian said, voice weary. People with business interests that occasionally conflict with federal investigations, and family members who ask too many questions. Footsteps outside resumed, moving away from the cottage. They're not federal agents, he added. They're cleanup specialists. Their job is to make sure this conversation never happened. Your backup? My handlers. They're here because someone, probably Victor, has been asking questions. The women weren't random victims. They were targets who knew things they shouldn't. Julian pulled out a different folder. These documents looked older, more authentic, and far more terrifying. Patricia Chambers wasn't just a Vermont school teacher, he said, revealing bank records showing deposits far beyond a teacher's salary. She managed finances for a drug network. When federal agencies began investigating, she had to disappear. I stared at the records, struggling to reconcile this version of Patricia. Margaret Torres laundered money for a casino. Elena Vasquez handled books for a rigged construction company. None were innocent, and your mother... Julian hesitated, something like regret flickering across his face. Your father's company laundered money. When he died, Carmen inherited assets certain people needed to recover. I was hired to marry her, gain access to those finances, then arrange for her to have an accident. Accident meaning the digitalis was supposed to cause a heart attack. Her history made it believable. Routine toxicology wouldn't catch it. I felt sick, but I kept listening. This was the truth I came for, what I didn't know. Julian continued, was that Carmen had been hiding evidence in Echo House recordings of me and my handlers. The conversations I told you about. The ones that could get us both killed. His phone buzzed. He paled reading the message. How long have you been in contact with Victor Malden? Why? They think he might have copies of the recordings. I thought about Echo House, the photos I'd taken, the updates I texted Victor. What if I did? Then we're both dead. Julian turned from the window, his expression desperate. The people I work for don't leave. Loose ends. They don't allow witnesses, and they don't forgive failure. Assets like you. For 30 years, I've eliminated problems that couldn't be handled publicly. Whistleblowers, accountants, family members. His phone rang. The call was short, tense. They want to know what Carmen recorded. Who else has it? I told them you're a grieving daughter, building conspiracies around a natural death. Why? Because if they believe the recordings are real, they'll kill you and me. But if they think you're just confused, they might let us live. Might. It's the best chance we have. Footsteps approached the cottage. Julian looked terrified. Zinnia, play along. Act confused, emotional. Let them think Victor fed you paranoid fantasies. In exchange, I'll tell you everything, every woman, every operation. But only if we survive the next hour. The front door opened. 2 armed men entered, middle-aged, in expensive suits that didn't hide their muscle. Mr. Langley, Miss Calderón. Julian stepped between us. Gentlemen! As I said, civilian interference based on misinformation. We'd like to hear her side, said the shorter man. I nodded. I've been trying to understand why my stepfather disappeared after my mother died. A friend suggested there might be more to the story. What kind of more? That Julian may have been involved in suspicious deaths. And what did you find? Nothing. Just coincidences, financial oddities, medical histories, things that can probably be explained. Anyone else involved? Victor helped me find Julian, but I've mostly worked alone. And the materials? Just public records. Another exchange of glances between the 2 men, this one longer and more significant. I had the sense that they were communicating about something I couldn't hear or see. Miss Calderón, the taller man said finally, we appreciate your cooperation. However, we're going to need you to turn over any materials you've collected during this investigation, including photographs, documents, and electronic records. Why? Because your investigation has inadvertently intersected with sensitive business matters that require discretion. Mr. Langley's work involves confidential client relationships that could be compromised by unauthorized disclosure of personal information. The explanation was smooth, professional, and completely meaningless, but it gave me an opening to test how much they actually knew about what I found. I don't have anything sensitive. Just copies of public records and some photographs I took of newspaper articles. We'll still need to review them. They're in my car. Then we'll accompany you to retrieve them. I looked at Julian, who nodded slightly. This was part of whatever plan he was improvising to keep us both alive. Of course, I said. I understand you need to protect your client's privacy. But as we prepared to leave the cottage, I caught something in the shorter man's expression that made my blood run cold. These men weren't here to debrief me or collect evidence. They were here to clean up a problem, and I was beginning to understand that the cleanup might involve more than just confiscating documents. Julian seemed to understand this too, because as we moved toward the door, he caught my eye and mouthed a single word: run. The problem was I had nowhere to run to. The cottage was surrounded. My car was probably being watched, and I had no idea how many other people might be involved in whatever was happening here. But I also had one advantage that Julian's handlers didn't know about. The real evidence was still hidden in Echo House, along with my mother's recordings and a complete documentation of Julian's crimes. If I could find a way to survive the next few hours, I might still be able to expose the truth. As we stepped outside into the cool October night, I began planning what might be the most important performance of my life. The night air was sharp, with salt and approaching winter, and I could see my breath as we walked toward my car under Julian's handler's careful watch. The cottage's warm lights spilled across the gravel driveway, casting shadows that moved like they had intentions of their own. I counted at least 3 figures stationed around the property, far enough to blur their faces, close enough to block any escape. Julian walked beside me, casual in posture, but alert. Near the car, he stumbled, studying himself on my shoulder as he pressed something into my palm, a key. The spare to Echo House. The materials are in my trunk, I said, pulling out my car keys and palming the house key. Mr. Garrett, the taller handler, nodded to his partner. Check the vehicle. As his partner searched the car, Garrett watched me with a predator's calm. Miss Calderón, you need to understand the sensitivity of the situation you've wandered into. I'm not sure I understand. Mr. Langley provides specialized consulting services to clients who value discretion, business leaders, political figures, others who can't afford publicity. His tone was friendly. The warning beneath it was not. When civilians dig into these histories, it creates complications. I wasn't trying to cause complications. I just wanted answers about my mother's death. And you received them? Natural causes? Your stepfather relocated. The finances were settled properly. The car was cleared. I opened the trunk and handed over a folder. Public records, clippings, photos, my cover story. This is everything. Garrett flipped through it. His relief was faint, tinged with disappointment. One more concern, he said. Victor Malden. We understand he's encouraged your investigation and shared unofficial information. Victor's just a family friend. Malden is a disgraced ex-cop with a history of false accusations. His involvement is problematic. Garrett's partner shifted closer. Julian moved subtly toward the property's edge. When I met his gaze, he signaled toward Echo House. Where is Malden now? Garrett asked. I don't know. He was supposed to meet me tomorrow. And what were you planning to tell him? The truth. That I found no evidence of wrongdoing. That I was wrong about Julian. It was the answer they wanted, but I knew truth didn't matter to them. They weren't here to uncover facts. They were here to bury them. We need to meet with Malden, Garrett said, to help him understand why continued investigation is inadvisable. I could talk to him, Julian offered. He trusts me. Garrett considered it. That would require Mr. Langley to maintain his identity longer, yes, but it would avoid civilian involvement. Julian was buying us time. Whether they'd accept, that was another question. We'll consider it, Garrett said. Now, your immediate plans. I'm returning to Boston. No further investigation. Good. We'll need assurance that your findings stay private. Garrett's partner retrieved a tablet. We're offering compensation travel, lost income, and your discretion. I don't need compensation. Nevertheless, we insist. The screen showed an NDA $50,000 in exchange for silence. It was generous and irrelevant. I had no intention of staying silent. I just have one question. What happens to Victor? He'll be given a similar opportunity. It sounded final. I'd like to call him. Let him know I'm dropping the investigation. Garrett hesitated, then handed me my phone. One call. Brief. Victor answered quickly. Zinnia? Are you? Okay. I'm fine. I talked to Julian. There's no evidence of anything suspicious. I'm heading back to Boston. You sound strange. I'm just tired. But I have closure now. Zinnia, I have to go. I'll call you when I'm home. I hung up, hoping he understood the message. Hidden in my words. Very good, Garrett said. Now, about the agreement. I glanced at the tablet. Actually, I should have my lawyer review this. Garrett's expression cooled. I understand, but $50,000 is a lot. I want to be sure. You're being compensated for discretion. Still, legal review feels right. I was stalling for Victor, for Julian, for any chance to get to Echo House alive, but Garrett was running out of patience. Miss Calderón, I'm afraid we can't allow you to involve additional parties in this matter. The agreement needs to be signed tonight, or we'll have to consider alternative approaches to ensuring your discretion. The threat was clear, and I realized that I was out of time for diplomacy. Whatever was going to happen next, it needed to happen soon. I understand, I said, reaching for the stylus again. But instead of signing the tablet, I suddenly stumbled backward, dropping the device and crying out as if I'd twisted my ankle. In the confusion of everyone moving to help or restrain me, Julian stepped forward and spoke quietly to Garrett. She's scared. Let me talk to her privately for a moment. I might be able to convince her to sign without causing additional complications. Garrett studied Julian's face, then nodded. 2 minutes. Julian helped me to my feet and guided me a few steps away from the others. Close enough to Echo House that I could see the dark outline of the hidden entrance Irene had told me about. Listen carefully, Julian whispered. In 30 seconds, I'm going to create a distraction. When I do, run toward the house and get inside. There's a passage from the basement to the cliffs. Irene can tell you how to find it if you can get to her apartment. What about you? I'll buy you as much time as I can. But Zinnia, you need to understand whatever evidence your mother left. Whatever recordings you think you have, none of it matters if you don't survive to use it. Why are you helping me? Julian's expression was complex, carrying guilt and determination in equal measure. Because I killed your mother and I can't undo that. But maybe I can keep her daughter alive long enough to get justice. Before I could respond, Julian straightened up and called out to Garrett. She's ready to sign. But as Garrett and his partner approached, Julian suddenly lunged toward the shorter man, grabbing for what I now realized was a gun concealed under his jacket. "Run!" Julian shouted, and I ran. Behind me, I heard shouts, the sound of a struggle, and then something that might have been gunfire. But I didn't look back. I sprinted toward Echo House's side entrance, fumbling with the key Julian had given me while voices behind me coordinated. Pursuit. The door opened just as I heard running footsteps on the gravel, and I slipped inside, locking it behind me and praying that Julian's sacrifice would give me enough time to reach the evidence that could expose his entire network in the darkness of Echo House. Surrounded by the ghosts of previous secrets, I began climbing toward the third floor in the hidden room that contained my mother's final gift to me, the truth that would either set us both free or get us both killed. The house was completely dark, and I didn't dare turn on any lights that might reveal my location to the people who were undoubtedly searching the property. I made my way through Echo House's familiar hallways by memory and touch, guided by the faint moonlight filtering through windows that faced away from the cottage. Behind me, I could hear vehicles arriving, voices coordinating a search, the sound of doors being tested and windows being examined. Julian's distraction had bought me maybe 5 minutes, and I had no idea whether he was still alive or what condition he might be in. The third floor felt different in the darkness, smaller, more intimate, like the house was closing around me protectively. I found the hidden panel behind the bookshelf and slipped into my mother's secret sanctuary, finally allowing myself to breathe. Everything was exactly as I'd left it hours earlier: the cassette player, the boxes of documents, the paintings that revealed so much about who my mother had really been. But now I understood that this room represented more than just my family's story. It was evidence of a criminal enterprise that had been operating for decades, destroying families and eliminating witnesses with the kind of systematic precision that suggested institutional protection. I needed to document everything. But my phone had been confiscated, and I had no way to contact Victor or anyone else who might help. The voices outside were getting closer, and I could hear someone testing the front door's lock. That's when I noticed something I'd missed during my earlier visit: a small digital camera sitting next to my mother's regular camera, the kind of device someone might use for covert surveillance. When I turned it on, I discovered it contained dozens of video files, all of them showing Julian in conversations with various people over the past several months. My mother hadn't just been recording audio. She'd been conducting video surveillance of Julian's activities, documenting meetings and conversations that revealed the scope of his criminal network. I scrolled through the files, finding footage of Julian meeting with men in expensive suits, accepting payment for services rendered, discussing upcoming assignments that involved specific women in various states. One conversation, filmed through the window of what looked like a restaurant, showed Julian receiving photographs and financial information about targets, including a woman in Connecticut who'd been scheduled for retirement within the next 6 months. But it was the final video file that made my blood run cold. Recorded just days before my mother's death, it showed Julian in conversation with someone whose voice I recognized: Garrett, the man who'd been questioning me outside the cottage. "The Calderón situation needs to be resolved quickly," Garrett was saying. "Carmen's become too suspicious, and her daughter's college applications are creating additional complications." "I understand the timeline," Julian replied. "But rushing the process increases the risk of detection. The risk of detection is acceptable. The risk of exposure is not. Carmen has been asking questions about previous assignments, and we've intercepted communications suggesting she may have contacted federal authorities. She hasn't contacted anyone. I monitor all her communications. Nevertheless, the decision has been made. Carmen dies this week, and the daughter needs to be positioned for eventual recruitment or elimination depending on her usefulness." I stopped the video, my hands shaking too badly to continue. They'd been planning to kill my mother for weeks, and they'd been discussing my own future as if I were just another asset to be managed or disposed of. But the conversation continued, and what I heard next changed everything I thought I understood about my family situation. "What about the construction company assets?" Garrett asked, still untraceable. Carmen never discovered the full scope of her husband's business relationships, and the daughter knows nothing about the money that's been accumulating in offshore accounts. "How much?" "Approximately $2.3 million, plus real estate holdings in 3 states. All of it accessible through the inheritance documents Carmen signed without understanding their implications." I felt the floor shift beneath me. My father hadn't just been a small-time contractor and gotten involved with criminals. He'd been part of a major money laundering operation, and the assets from that operation were still sitting in accounts that technically belonged to me. The voices outside were getting closer, and I could hear someone on the second floor moving systematically through rooms. I needed to find a way out of the house, but I also needed to preserve the evidence that could expose Julian's entire network. That's when I remembered Julian's mention of a passage from the basement to the cliffs. If I could reach Irene's apartment, she might be able to help me contact Victor, or find another way to get the evidence to authorities who could act on it. I gathered my mother's digital camera and several of the most incriminating documents, stuffing them into a bag I found in the corner of the room. The cassette tapes were too bulky to carry all of them, but I took the ones labeled with the most recent dates, hoping they contained the most current information about Julian's activities. Moving back through the house was terrifying. Every creak of the floorboards seemed impossibly loud, and I could hear multiple people searching the lower floors. But I made it to the basement without being detected, and it only took a few minutes to find what Julian had been referring to, behind the furnace. A section of the stone foundation had been fitted with a hidden door that opened onto a narrow tunnel carved into the bedrock. It was the kind of passage that wealthy families in the 1800s had used for smuggling or protection during wartime, and it had been maintained well enough to suggest recent use. The tunnel was dark and damp, but it led steadily downward toward what I hoped would be an exit near the water. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I emerged from a concealed opening in the cliff face about a quarter mile from Echo House. From my position on the rocks, I could see the activity around the cottage and main house multiple. Vehicles, flashlights moving through the darkness, people coordinating what looked like a professional search operation. But I could also see the village beyond, including the apartment building where Irene lived. It took me 20 minutes to work my way along the coastline to a point where I could climb back up to street level without being seen. Irene's apartment was on the second floor, and when I knocked on her door, she answered wearing a bathrobe and an expression of deep concern. "Zinnia, what are you doing here? It's past midnight. I need your help. Julian and his people are at Echo House, and I think they're planning to kill me." Irene stepped back, pulling me inside and locking the door behind me. I knew something was wrong when I saw all those cars. Julian's never had visitors like that. "Irene, I need to use your phone to call Victor Malden. And I need you to know that whatever Julian told you about why he was terminated, it wasn't true." "I know, dear. I've known for months that Julian wasn't who he claimed to be." Irene led me to her small kitchen and handed me her landline phone. As I dialed Victor's number, she put a kettle on for tea with a kind of practical calm that suggested she'd been through crises before. "Victor, it's Zinnia. I'm at Irene Martel's apartment in Pemaquid Point, and I need help." "Jesus, Zinnia, I've been trying to reach you for hours. Your call earlier tonight sounded like someone was holding a gun to your head." "Someone was." "Victor, Julian isn't working alone. He's part of a network that's been killing people for decades, and they have protection at levels we didn't anticipate." "What kind of protection?" "The kind that makes federal investigations disappear. The kind that allows multiple murders to be written off as natural causes. The kind that makes people like us disappear permanently if we threaten their operations." I could hear Victor processing this information, understanding the implications for both of us. "Where are you now?" "Safe for the moment, but not for long. They're going to figure out where I went, and when they do, they'll come here. I can have state police there in 30 minutes. "No, Victor, these people have been operating for decades without being caught. They have resources we can't compete with through normal channels. Then what do you want me to do?" I looked at Irene, who was listening to the conversation while preparing tea as if hosting fugitives was a normal part of her evening routine. I need you to contact someone with enough authority to bypass local and federal agencies that might be compromised. Someone who can act on evidence without going through channels that Julian's network might control. Who? Who? I don't know. But Victor, I have video evidence of Julian's handlers discussing multiple murders, including my mother's. I have financial records showing money laundering operations worth millions of dollars. I have documentation of a criminal enterprise that's been operating across state lines for at least 30 years. Where is this evidence? With me. But if something happens to me, you need to know where to find the rest of it. I gave Victor detailed instructions about the hidden room in Echo House, about the passage to the cliffs, about everything my mother had left behind. If I didn't survive the night, at least someone would know the truth about what had happened to our family. Zinnia, Victor said when I finished, I want you to find a place to hide until sunrise. Don't go back to your car, don't try to leave town, don't do anything that might put you in contact with Julian's people. I'm going to make some calls to federal contacts who aren't part of the local network. What if they're all compromised? Then we're fucked. But if there are clean federal agents who can act on this evidence, they need to know about it before Julian's network realizes how much you've discovered. After I hung up, Irene brought me a cup of tea and sat down across from me at her small kitchen table. You know, she said quietly, I've been waiting 40 years for someone to ask the right questions about Echo House. What do you mean? I mean, Julian isn't the first man to use that house for business that wasn't quite legitimate. I mean, the reason I recognized him as someone dangerous is because I've seen his type before. Irene sipped her tea, her eyes focused on something beyond the present moment. My first husband worked for people like Julian's handlers. Good people who got involved with bad business, people who knew too much about money that came from places it shouldn't have come from. What happened to him? Heart attack at 43. Perfectly healthy man, no family history, no risk factors. But he'd been asking questions about irregularities in accounts he was managing, and some of those questions made powerful people nervous. Irene reached across the table and touched my hand. The difference is, your mother was smart enough to document what was happening. My husband just trusted that doing the right thing would protect him. Did you ever try to prove what really happened? With what? I was a young widow with no education and no resources, going up against people who could make problems disappear. But I kept my eyes open, and when I saw Julian operating the same way my husband's employers had operated, I started paying attention. What did you see? Meetings at odd hours. Phone calls in languages I didn't recognize. Financial documents. Being burned in the fireplace. And women, always women who would visit for a few months and then disappear. Irene's words confirmed what I'd learned from my mother's hidden evidence, but they also suggested that the criminal network Julian worked for had been operating much longer than I'd realized. How long has this been going on? Decades. Maybe longer. The people at the top change, the methods evolve, but the basic business stays the same: cleaning dirty money and eliminating people who threaten to expose the cleaning process. Outside, I could hear vehicles moving through the village, and I knew it was only a matter of time before Julian's people expanded their search to include Irene's apartment. I need to ask you for something dangerous, I said. What? I need you to help me get back to Echo House. There's more evidence in that hidden room, and I need to document everything before they destroy it. Irene looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. I've been waiting 40 years to see people like Julian face justice. If there is a chance this evidence can make that happen, then it's worth the risk. It could get us both killed. Dear, I'm 71 years old. If I'm going to die, I'd rather it be while doing something that matters. Irene stood and moved to a closet, returning with a heavy jacket and a flashlight. There's a service road that runs behind the village to the lighthouse. It connects to a trail that leads back to Echo House through the woods, away from the main property. If we're careful, we can get there without being seen. And then what? Then you do whatever needs to be done to make sure your mother's death means something. As we prepared to leave, I felt the weight of everything that had brought me to this moment: 10 years of grief and anger, months of investigation, hours of confrontation with the man who destroyed my family. But I also felt something I hadn't experienced since my mother's death, the sense that I wasn't fighting alone anymore. Whatever happened in the next few hours, Carmen Calderón's final gift to her daughter was about to fulfill its purpose. The truth was going to come out, and Julian Hart's network of killers and thieves was going to face the consequences they'd avoided for far too long. Dawn was breaking over. Pemaquid Point when the federal agents arrived, real ones this time, with badges and authority that couldn't be bought or intimidated. Victor had managed to reach someone at the Department of Justice who specialized in organized crime cases, and that person had been very interested in video. Evidence of interstate murder-for-hire operations. Irene and I had spent 3 hours in Echo House's hidden room, using our camera to document everything my mother had left behind. We'd found additional evidence that painted a picture of a criminal enterprise stretching back 40 years, involving dozens of victims and millions of dollars in laundered assets. Julian was arrested at the cottage, where he'd been found with a gunshot wound to his shoulder and a story about interrupting a burglary that no one believed. His handlers had disappeared, but not before leaving behind enough evidence to suggest they'd been operating with protection from corrupt officials and multiple agencies. Investigation that followed unraveled a network that had been using legitimate businesses to launder money for organized crime while eliminating witnesses who threatened to expose their operations. Julian wasn't just a serial killer, he was part of a systematic approach to protecting criminal enterprises by murdering the people who might testify against them. 3 months later, I stood in the cemetery where my mother was buried, holding a copy of the indictment that charged Julian Hart with 4 counts of murder in the first degree. Victor was with me, along with Irene, who'd become something like the grandmother I never had. She knew, I said, looking down at the simple headstone that bore my mother's name and the dates that had defined her too short life. She knew they were going to kill her, and she spent her final months building the case that would eventually destroy them. She was braver than any of us realized, Victor said. She was smarter, too. Everything she needed us to find, she left. In places where we'd eventually discover it. Like she was playing a game of chess that lasted 10 years. The financial investigation had revealed the existence of accounts worth over $2 million money from my father's construction company that had been hidden in offshore accounts for over 20 years. It turned out that my father hadn't been a willing participant in money laundering. He discovered that his business was being used for criminal purposes and had been trying to extract himself when he died in what everyone had assumed was an accident. The money was mine now legally and ethically, but I decided to use most of it to fund an organization that would help families of crime victims navigate the kind of institutional obstacles I'd faced while seeking justice for my mother. What are you going to do now? Irene asked. I looked around the cemetery at the peaceful setting that had seemed so final when I'd first buried my mother here, and realized it felt different now. Not like an ending, but like a place where one story concluded and another began. I'm going to keep doing what Mom taught me to do. I'm going to repair broken things, preserve what's worth saving, and make sure that important stories don't get lost. 6 months later, I reopened my restoration workshop in Boston, but I also started teaching courses for crime victims, families about how to conduct their own investigations when official channels failed them. The organization I'd founded, the Calderón Institute for Justice, had helped 3 families expose corruption in cases that had been written off as unsolvable. Julian Hart was serving 4 consecutive life sentences, and the investigation into his network had led to arrests in 6 states. The criminal enterprise that had protected him for decades was dismantled, though I suspected that other networks were already forming to fill the gap they'd left behind. But that was someone else's fight now. I'd learned that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about making sure the truth gets told, that victims are remembered, that the systems that failed them get better. My mother's paintings hung in my workshop now, the ones she created in secret while documenting Julian's crimes. They were beautiful and haunting, full of the kind of truth that can only come from someone who's faced darkness and chosen to create light instead, every day. As I worked on restoring books and documents that others had given up on, I thought about the hidden room in Echo House where my mother had fought her final battle. She'd lost that battle in the short term, but she'd won the war that mattered, the war for truth, for justice, for the protection of people who couldn't protect themselves. And every day I understood a little more clearly that some inheritances aren't about money or property. Some inheritances are about courage, determination, and the refusal to let evil triumph simply because it's powerful. My mother had left me the most valuable inheritance of all, the knowledge that ordinary people can defeat extraordinary corruption if they're willing to be patient, careful, and absolutely relentless in pursuit of the truth. It had taken me 10 years to fully understand that gift. But now that I did, I was determined to use it wisely. The story ends where it began, with a daughter seeking answers about her mother's death, But the daughter who found those answers was not the same person who'd started looking for them. She was stronger, wiser, and surrounded by people who understood that some fights are worth having, no matter how long they take or how difficult they become. Carmen Calderón had been silenced by her killers, but her voice lived on in the evidence. She'd left behind in the justice she'd made possible, and in the daughter who'd learned that love sometimes means spending years preparing for a single moment, when truth can finally triumph over power. That moment had come and gone, but its effects would ripple outward for years to come, protecting other families from the kind of loss mine had suffered, ensuring that other victims' stories would be heard and believed that it wasn't the ending I'd imagined when I first knocked on Julian Hart's door. But it was the ending my mother had planned for, an ending that honored her memory by creating a future where people like Julian couldn't operate with impunity. Sometimes, the best revenge is making sure the person who hurt you can never hurt anyone else ever again. Sometimes, justice looks like a quiet victory that most people will never hear about. But that changes everything for the people it saves. My mother had taught me both of those lessons, and I would spend the rest of my life living up to the example. She'd set not the example of the broken woman Julian had tried to create, but the example of the fierce, strategic, uncompromising fighter she'd been in those final months, when she'd chosen to document the truth rather than simply survive it. He thought he got away with it. But my mother had always been playing a longer game than he realized, and in the end, that game was the one that mattered. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.